Hi students, my name is Ben. I'm the director of the Eudora Community Museum, which I'm standing in right now. Typically at this time of year, third graders like yourselves come to our museum for a field trip. They get a tour of the museum, they go on a scavenger hunt, and then we go outside and we do a walking tour of downtown Eudora along Main Street. And I point out some of the historic sites and buildings in Eudora. Fortunately, we can't do that this year because of the pandemic, but I'm happy to at least be able to bring this to you virtually so you can see and experience what the other third graders experience when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. And when all of this gets better and when everyone is safe again, I hope everyone can come and visit us in person. And because this is your museum. This museum belongs to the entire community. That's why we call it the Eudora Community Museum. Some of you may have been in here. Some of you might not have visited. Some of you might have never been to a museum before, and you might even be wondering what a museum is. Well, a museum is a building where people collect things and put them on display. There's different types of museums. There's art museums where people collect paintings and sculptures. There's science museums, and then we're a history museum. It's our job to collect history, to document history, and to display history. So what we do is people bring us old things, what we call artifacts. They bring us old, important things, and we put them on display, and we protect them so they don't get wrecked or destroyed or damaged. And then we let the people come in and look at them so people can learn from them. It's our job to tell people about the history of their community. We think that's a really important thing. We think it's really important that everyone understands the history of their town because we think that gives them some pride and they have a better understanding of their town and they're more prideful about their town. And that's what we do here in this building. Our community dates all the way back to 1857. In 1857, a company of German immigrants came here and they purchased a lot of land from a member of the Shawnee tribe named Pascal Fish. Pascal is what we call a chief or a leader of the Shawnee tribe. He was a Native American. And Pascal sold all of this land to this German immigrant company for $10,000, which was actually a lot of money back then, so Pascal became a very rich man. And the Germans that came here were so happy to be able to purchase this land that they decided to name the community Eudora, after his daughter, Eudora Fish. And we actually have a picture of Eudora Fish right here. As far as we know, that's the only known picture of Eudora Fish. And on the walking tour that we're about to go on, you'll see the statue of Pascal and Eudora in the park as well. We don't actually have any photographs of Pascal Fish, so we don't actually know what he looked like. But we do have one of his daughter, Eudora, thankfully. Just sit back and imagine that for a second. You guys are about 8 years old, about 9 years old. There was an 8-year-old girl that had a whole town named after her. That would be a pretty cool thing to have a whole town named after you. And so that's when our history kind of starts as a community. And so ever since then, we've tried to document the different stories and the different history of our community. And there's lots of different stories, and there's lots of different events that have shaped who we are as a community. The first thing you see when you walk into our museum is this collection of Native American artifacts right here. These are very important items to us because they tell us a lot about the history of the Native Americans that lived here. Before Eudora was founded as a German community, Native Americans have lived here for thousands of years. And up here in the red box is a collection of arrowheads that Native Americans used as tools. Some of those arrowheads are probably thousands of years old. Native Americans used arrowheads as weapons, and they also used them as a tool to cut things. We also have some different pottery fragments here from some Native Americans. That's from the Delaware tribe particularly. And then also in that red box we have some beads. Native Americans traded with beads a lot. They used beads as currency, as their money. They were a very important item of property for Native Americans. And so over here we have some robes from the Eudora Oddfellows Lodge. On the walking tour you'll see where the Oddfellows still meet. They still meet above on the second story of one of our buildings here on Main Street. But they dress up in robes like this and they do secret chants and secret things, which is kind of interesting. There's not many of them left. People used to join clubs like this in the 1800s as a form of entertainment. Because you have to understand, in the 1800s, TV didn't exist, computers didn't exist. Men needed something to do in the evenings for fun, so they often joined clubs like this one. Over here we have a little tiny high chair that was made by Charles Durr, one of the town founders. This is a kind of neat item. This is a piece of a stained glass window from a church here in Eudora. This is one of my favorite items down here because it's kind of unusual. This is what we call a chamber pot, which is kind of a toilet. Because in the 1800s, people didn't have toilets. There was no such thing as indoor plumbing. When people had to go to the bathroom, they went out into the backyard and they used an outhouse, which was just a hole dug in the ground. But let's say it's winter, let's say it's in the middle of the night, let's say it's snowing, and you don't want to put on your heavy winter coat to go to the bathroom, you just hop on one of these chamber pots and you go to the bathroom in a chamber pot. And this is a very fancy one. And I wouldn't want to be the one that has to empty the chamber pot every morning. It probably wasn't a fun job. Over here we have some old adding machines, a typewriter. This is probably the most famous thing to ever be invented in Eudora. It's called the Splint Roll. There was a man in Eudora named Leo Lauber who invented it. This is a roll of plaster that would be used to help make casts for broken arms or legs. You just wrap this around your broken arm or leg and you put water on it, it hardened, and it'd form a cast. And Dr. Lauber, who invented this, made tens of millions of dollars selling those, and he invented it right here in Eudora. In this case right here, we just have a collection of items from the sunflower plant, and I'll show you something else we have from the sunflower plant, and it's this item right here. This is a model of a sulfuric acid concentrating plant. The sunflower ammunition plant opened during World War II. They made powder for weapons, for bullets and bombs. And this was a very large building out there. This is just a model of it, of course. But it's a pretty cool model. A lot of little pieces that went into making it. In this display case right here, we have some things that were recovered from the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail went right through Eudora. The Oregon Trail was what people used to go west, to Oregon to California, in the 1840s to the 1860s. This was before railroads existed. The only way to get west would be to walk the whole way. And they rode in covered wagons like this. Typically, covered wagons were packed full of stuff, so there was no room to sit in the wagons. You had to walk beside it, and the wagons are usually pulled by some oxen. And right here, we have a bunch of little things that were dug up out of the ground along the Oregon Trail right here in Eudora. They were dug out of the ground at a place called Blue Jackets Crossing. And you can imagine that travelers on the trail dropped those things, and then someone dug them up almost 200 years later, and now we have them on display. This is just a collection of things we have from Eudora High School athletics. Obviously, sports has been a big part of the history of Eudora. Speaking of which, in this display case right here, this is a picture of Eudora's only bowling alley. It was on the Chopper farm, just west of town. It was outdoors. And as far as we know, this is the only bowling alley we ever had here. It doesn't exist anymore. But what's kind of neat is that we have some of the items from that bowling alley. We still have some bowling balls from there. They're made out of wood, and they only have 2 finger holes in it. We also have some of the bowling pins from that bowling alley as well. So these are about 100 years old. We have a bunch of different things in this case here, including the game of Eudora, which is just like the game of Monopoly, but it's the Eudora edition of it. Over here we have some creepy stuffed animals and dolls. This is a picture of Ruth Hughes. She was the first woman to ever become mayor of Eudora. Back in the old days, women weren't allowed to become mayors, but today they are, and hopefully we'll have a lot more women serving as mayor in the future here in Eudora. In this case, we have the World War II uniform of a man named Raymond Weinbach. He's still alive, and he's in his late 90s. He fought in the Pacific during World War II, and he was nice enough to give us his uniform. This is probably the oldest couch in Eudora. This was made by Charles Durr in the 1870s. He made it by hand, which is impressive because he was not a furniture maker by trade. He was a mill operator, so he wasn't a professional, but he still managed to make this. When you come into our museum, you'll see a big part of what we do here is we house different collections, archives. And in this back part of our museum here, this is where we house all of the important documents from Eudora's history. We have information relating to different Eudora families. That's our case full of maps. In those cases, we have all of our newspapers. We also have photographs, manuscripts, diary entries, anything relating to the history of Eudora we want to collect. And if it's a piece of paper or a photograph or a newspaper, we put them in this part of the museum. If it's an actual physical object, then we put it on display in the other part of our museum. I'm holding two boxes right now that have the two most important items in our entire museum. Most people don't get to see these, so you're pretty lucky to be able to see these because I never bring these out for most people. In the first box, I have that photograph I was talking about earlier of Eudora fish. This is the only known photo of Eudora fish. It's on a piece of metal which is called a tintype. This picture was probably taken in the 1860s. We think it may have been her wedding photo. And we're very thrilled to have it. We keep it safe and sound in this box. And then the other box has the original deed to Eudora. This is the old document that started our community. What's cool is that you can see Pascal Fish, his name right there. Pascal Fish was the Shawnee Native American that owned all of this land, and he signed it over to a German immigrant company. This piece of paper got passed down in the Durr family from generation to generation, and then it ended up in another museum, and then a few years ago we got it. And so we also keep this safe and sound in a box, locked up, and most people don't ever get to see it. The building I'm standing in right now was first built in 1866. It was built by a man named Henry Cope, and he was a shoemaker. And actually the oldest part of our building is this part right here. This part was built in 1866. And if you can see between the quilts there on the wall, we have limestone walls, which is one way to tell when a building's really old, if it has limestone walls. And then in 1869, a man named John Siebold got this building, and he enlarged it. He made it quite a bit bigger. He built this part of our building, and he ran a tin shop and a hardware store. He sold pieces of tin, which are little pieces of metal, and then people paid him to hang it on their ceilings. It was kind of what rich people used to like to decorate their ceilings with back then. And John lived on the second story of this building with his family, which we'll go upstairs in a minute, and I'll show you our second story as well. And then later on, this was home to the Eudora Post Office, which one thing we have from when it was a post office is this right here. These are the Eudora Postal Boxes from when this building was the post office. This building was the post office for about 30 years, starting in 1897. This is probably one of the strangest items we have, but I like it a lot. This is a former telephone pole or utility pole that used to be right up on top of the block right here at 7th and Main Street in front of City Hall. And what's so cool about this is that there's thousands of nails and staples that were hammered into this sign, into this utility pole, I mean. People would have hung signs on this utility pole. They would have taken, you know, a poster or a piece of paper and hammered it in there. Paper would say garage sale, missing dog, stuff like that. I don't think you'll ever see one with more nails in it. And about 7 years ago, I saw that they were going to replace it with a new pole because this one's kind of old. And I asked the city public works if they could give us this old pole, and sure enough, when I came to work one morning, this was sitting in front of our door, which was really nice of them to give it to us. Down here is one of our most cherished items as well. This is the tombstone of a young girl named Isabelle Johnson. She was a young black girl in the 1860s. She died very young. She died in 1861. She was only 7 years old. Her parents were from Virginia, and they may have been slaves when they were first born, because at that time slavery existed, which was a really horrible thing. But her parents became freed, and they came out here to Kansas, and they were farmers. And then their oldest daughter, she was their oldest daughter, she died very young, but they had a lot of other kids. I think they had up to 14 kids after Isabelle. What is interesting about this and why this ended up in our museum is that we think this was originally located in what we call the Southwest Cemetery, which is the Black Cemetery. And at some point, this got dislodged or got washed away because it ended up on a neighboring property. And they dug it out of the ground. They gave it to us. We cleaned it up. And now we have it on display here. It tells, I think, a really vivid and sad story. Back then, sadly, people died very young, very often, because people would get sick and there wasn't any medicine to help them. So it was sadly very common back then that kids would die at a young age. So we're lucky to live in an age where we have medicine and we can get better when we get sick. Right here, this is a painting of the Victory Movie Theater. which you'll see where the site was on our walking tour. This was built in 1942, but it burned down in 1966. This is a picture of Miss America 1968. Her name was Deborah Barnes. She was a Eudora resident. She lived in Eudora in the 1970s. She was a piano teacher in Eudora. And so we claim her as one of our own. Not many towns can say they've had a Miss America living there. So we're pretty proud of that. These display cases are all about the Civil War in Eudora. You probably haven't learned much about the Civil War yet, but you will in a year or two in school. The Civil War was between the North and the South. And the North wanted to end slavery, and the South wanted to keep slavery. Eudora in Kansas was in the North, and they fought on the side against slavery. And a lot of people in Eudora fought against slavery. They fought for the Union Army. And there was also a very scary thing that happened in 1863. There was a bad man from Missouri named William Quantrell, and he rode with about 400 men on horses into Lawrence, and he destroyed the city and he killed a lot of people. But before he got into Lawrence, he rode right through Eudora. He didn't stop here. He only killed a couple of people in Eudora. But people in Eudora were scared, and they were concerned that he might go try to hurt people in Lawrence, which he did. So 3 men in Eudora, from Eudora, rode off on horseback to try to warn the residents of Lawrence. But 1 man was thrown from his horse, and he broke his arm, so he didn't make it. Another man was thrown from his horse as well, and he actually died from his injuries. And the 3rd man actually stopped to help the 2nd man that got hurt. So no one from Eudora made it in time. And sadly, Lawrence got destroyed. And then after the raid, people in Eudora could have seen all the smoke in the sky because they burned all the buildings in Eudora. And so all of the men in town got guns, and they were waiting at the edge of town in case Quantrell would come through Eudora. But he didn't. He went a different way. So he didn't come here, but they were ready for him. And then we just have a lot of other display cases full of a lot of other little things, which I encourage you guys to come here and see it in person sometime. There's no way I could possibly point out everything right now, so I'm just trying to show you some of the more notable things, but I hope you guys can come back and learn some more on your own sometime. This is that's Pete's pen collection. A couple of boys once counted over 1,000 pens in there. This item is by far the heaviest item in our whole museum. It's called a trip hammer. And this was from a blacksmith shop here in Eudora. It's called Zimmerman Blacksmith. Blacksmiths were very important people. They were kind of like the car mechanics of that era, because people didn't have horses yet, but they needed blacksmiths who would make horseshoes, and they'd work with metal, and they'd build tools and stuff. And this was a very large, heavy piece of machinery. It was operated on a pulley system. They didn't have electricity yet, so it was steam powered. Later on, there was an electrical motor put on it. But this would have been used to pound things like this. This would have come down and it would have pounded things. And you would put a really hot piece of metal in there, and then this would come down and it'd pound things, and it'd put it into shape. So you could make a tool. You could make plowshares. You could make an axe. You could make anything you wanted with it. And since this weighs so much, we're never going to move this thing. So it's here to stay. This display right here is devoted to Eudora and water, particularly with the Kansas River. And the Kansas River is the largest river in Kansas. It's just north of Eudora. Eudora also sits on the Wakarusa River, which merges into the Kansas River here. Wakarusa is a Native American word that means hip deep. We think it got its name once because someone was walking across it. A Native American was walking across it with a European. And when she was in the middle of the river, the water came up to her hip, and she yelled, "Wakarusa!" And they said, "What does that mean?" And she said, "It means hip deep." So that's how we got the name Wakarusa. And anyway, the river is notable because, on the one hand, it brings a lot of fertile farmland. So that basically means crops like wheat and corn grow really well by the river. So people are able to make a lot of money. But the other bad thing about the river, though, is that it floods. And unfortunately, the river is flooded in Eudora a lot. and it floods people's homes, people's farms. It destroys everything. The worst flood was in 1951. These pictures are from 1951. And just about every farm in the Kansas River Valley was destroyed. Thankfully, we don't get much flooding anymore because in 1980, they started to build dams on some of the rivers, which stopped the water. So they could prevent more floods from happening. And we haven't had that bad of a flood since 1951. There's a bunch of cool things in this case that I usually like to show students. And I encourage you guys to come check it out sometime. This is probably the oldest telephone from Eudora. This belonged to Charles Pilla, who also owned the Pilla department store and had the Pilla house. And this is how you operated it. You talked into it like that, and you listened like this. So that looks quite a bit different than our phones today. This is a viewfinder. It's almost like a VR headset. You'd look through it, and it'd be a 3D image. So this is what kids would do for fun 120 years ago. This is called a boot spur. A cowboy or a farmer would have worn this on the back of his boot, and he would have been able to control horses with it. If he wanted the horse to go faster, he'd kick the horse with it, or if he wanted to stop the horse, he'd dig his boot spur into it. Here's a horseshoe. This is what horses put on the bottom of their hooves. This little bottle is full of peppermint. And what's really cool about this is it still has a smell to it. It still smells like peppermint, even though it's 120 years old. So if you guys ever come here in person, ask me to smell the peppermint. It's kind of cool. And then this item, this is called a bayonet. Civil War soldiers had these at the end of their rifles during war. And this was dug up right here in Eudora. It was dug up along the Oregon Trail. And then this is called a sad iron. It weighs a lot. This is how you would have ironed your clothes back then. You would have heated it up on the stove, and then you would have run it over your clothes. This is a very important little item. This is the head to a coal hammer. There would have been a piece of wood up, going through it. But a lot of kids would have learned how to use this back then because we didn't have electricity in Eudora a long time ago. And most houses were heated by coal. And so people would get large lumps of coal, and then you'd have to divide the coal into smaller pieces to put in the furnace so you could stay warm during the winter. And a lot of times the kids had to break the coal up, and they would have used a coal hammer like this. And this is cool because it says Eudora on it. It's from the Eudora Lumber Company, which is why we have it in here. Up here we have a couple of cool things. This is just a football helmet, and then this is the top of Eudora Cardinal mascot from about the year 2000. We actually have the whole costume, the whole outfit in storage. That's a lot of what we have on the first story. Now I'll show you what we have on our second story. We don't have as much up here, but that's still pretty cool. I'm standing right now in what we call the addition at our museum, which we built a few years back. So this is a newer part of the building that was added on. This actually used to be the outside of our building, but now it's inside. We built this so we have an easier time getting upstairs. And we'll go in here. We don't have much on display here, but we do have the Hesper Curtain, which is one of our favorite items. This hung at the Hesper Schoolhouse, and it was used as their stage curtain in the 1930s. So the kids would put on plays, and they'd have concerts, and you could raise and lower this curtain, which is what they used it for. Over here is one of my favorite parts of our building. So when we got our building originally, all of the walls looked like this. They were deteriorated. They had fallen apart. And we spent a couple of years restoring our walls. So now they look like this. They look brand new. This is called plaster. That's what they used to put on walls back in the 1800s. And if you peel the plaster back, this is what you get. And it's kind of cool because you can see how the building was built. So you have lumber right here as supports, and then they put in limestones in between the wood, and then they covered it with plaster, which is the white stuff. And if you look real closely at all of this white stuff, you see little bits of hair mixed into it because they mixed in horsehair with the plaster. to help the plaster stay together. And originally, when this building was built, all the walls would have been painted. But later on, people liked wallpaper, and they put wallpaper on. So this is still some of the old wallpaper on the building right now. This is kind of cool. This is from a shipping crate, basically a package from the 1800s. It says JAS, Eudora, Kansas. That stands for John A. Siebold. He was the man who built this building. And John had 5 kids and a wife and his brother-in-law, and they all lived in these 2 rooms right here. So what is that? That's 7 people living in very close quarters. And we think that they probably slept up here. At least the children probably slept upstairs. There's a little stairway right here that goes up to the attic. And it is unimaginably hot up there in the summer, and it is unimaginably cold up there in the winter. I can't even imagine what it would have been like to live up there with no heating, no air conditioning back then. We have it lucky today. And then on the steps right here, this is some old linoleum. That was probably from the 1920s. And then you'll notice on this half of our second story, it's just brick, no limestone. Well, that concludes our tour of the museum. I think I've shown you a lot of the most important things in here, and I hope I've been able to teach you a little bit about the history of Eudora. But there's a lot more to see, and we hope that you guys can come visit us sometime. Bring your parents, bring your friends, and there's a lot more to see here. And think of this as your museum, because it is. It belongs to the entire community. So we want people to have fun here, to feel at home here, and to learn about history. That's why we're here. We're here to teach you about history. So come on down and visit us, and hope to see you soon.